Good morning, and thank you all for joining us in another one of our series in our online programs. I'm Sandra Crane. Yes, the Commission is a secular, nonpartisan agency that strives to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and promote public understanding of the history. So today, we're going to be looking at the Japanese American experience during World War II. While human rights atrocities in Europe come to mind, the Japanese American experience in our country illustrates how prejudice and abuse of power impacted another group of vulnerable people during World War II. So the incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war stemmed from racism, economic interests, and it raised many questions about our democratic values and our constitutional law. Okay, from a legal and constitutional viewpoint, let's take a look at the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. According to these constitutional amendments, American citizens have the right to be safe from unwarranted searches and seizures and can't be imprisoned for a length of time without due process of law. What do these two amendments say? Is that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Those accused of a crime shall enjoy the right to a speedy trial by an impartial jury and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusations. Now let's take a look at how these abuses began. Okay, in this slide, we can see here that there are Chinese working in the fields, working on the railroads, and this is where the story begins. The seeds of prejudice were sown during nearly a century before, when the first immigrants from Asia arrived in California during the gold rush between 1848 and 49. California was a lawless frontier. About 25% of the miners came from China, and then intense and violent acts of competition between groups took place. The American newcomers drove the Chinese out of the mining areas. When California became a state in 1850, the lawless violence was transformed into legal discrimination. By 1870, there were 63,000 Chinese in the United States. Over half of them were in California. That year, the Chinese miners contributed more than $5 million to the state coffers through the foreign miners tax, almost 1/4 of the state's revenue. So we can see here, this is a perfect example of how economic interests were being protected. So despite their contribution, these people were victims of legal discrimination. In 1882, Congress enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, the only American law to specifically bar one group from immigrating to the United States. Now let's see how this impacted the Japanese. So we can see here in this slide, we can see Japanese working in the fields, and they had their own shops and laundries. So while the Chinese were prohibited from immigrating, the agricultural industry needed another group to do menial labor at low wages. Beginning about 1885, Japanese laborers were recruited to work in the sugar cane fields in Hawaii and the fruit and vegetable farms in California. As long as the Japanese remained docile, they were welcomed. As soon as they showed any signs of initiative, they were perceived as threats to white dominance. Anti-Japanese campaigns began with acts of unchecked mob violence and arson, and especially directed towards shop owners, as you see in the left-hand corner, as they were perceived as an economic threat. Now we can look at some newspaper articles, and this is from the San Francisco Chronicle, the Seattle Star, 1905. And we can see these incendiary editorials right here. As with earlier Chinese pioneers, Japanese from certain occupations were also denied citizenship and were forced to send their children to segregated schools. They were also prohibited from marrying white people. Other prohibitions included laws that denied them the right to own or lease agricultural land. Newspapers, radios, and movies stereotyped Japanese Americans as untrustworthy and unable to assimilate. Does it sound familiar? And we can see these incendiary titles. The next slide here, brown men are most dangerous. Okay, we can see here people working on their own farms. A large number of Japanese men and American women pioneered, married, and resulted in an American-born generation. As Japan became a military power in the early 20th century, the media falsely depicted Japanese in America as agents for Japan. Look at these slides. Do they look like agents for Japan? Japanese were forced to live in segregated neighborhoods. Although those born in the United States were culturally American and spoke English fluently, they still faced insurmountable discrimination in employment, housing, and social interaction. And here we see the glaring headlines bringing the United States into World War II. Prior to World War II, Germany and Japan became military powers and began annexing neighboring nations. Japan invaded China in 1937. And in 1941, the United States, Britain, and the Dutch Indies imposed a total embargo on exports to Japan, cutting off Japanese oil supply. The Japanese military forces then attacked the United States military base in Hawaii and Philippines on December 7, 1941. And the next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan. Now the story begins. Take a look at the slide on the left-hand side. I was quite surprised to see this anti-Japanese, the stereotypical, racial stereotypical cartoon that was illustrated by Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss. And Dr. Seuss was a famous illustrator and our very famous author of hundreds of American children's books. And on the right, we see the Department of Justice interning lots of Japanese here early in 1942. A few days after the declaration of war, the FBI arrested over 2,000 persons of Japanese ancestry through the United States and in the territories of Alaska and Hawaii. Some were American citizens. There were never charges of espionage, sabotage, or any crime filed against those arrested. They were apprehended only because they were thought to be suspicious persons. This removal of the Japanese was the culmination of the movement to eliminate Asians from the West Coast that began 100 years ago. Okay, and here we see an executive order. This was issued by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 20th, 1942. He issued this order for military commanders to remove any person from any area for any area. Interestingly enough, it didn't mention any specific group, nor were the Japanese Americans in Hawaii incarcerated in mass numbers. Obviously, Hawaii was far enough removed, so they didn't think anybody could be a saboteur or a spy. But look at this, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. So this was a government-issued edict. The order gave Secretary of War Henry L. Simpson the authority to carry out the roundups of approximately 110,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. It's important to note, as we said earlier, that 2/3 of these people were American citizens. They were ordered to leave their homes, their farms, their businesses on the West Coast. The Japanese Americans were never accused of any crime, nor were they given a chance to prove their innocence. Again, violations of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Even the Supreme Court did not protect these Japanese Americans. Except for the removal of Native Americans from their homelands earlier in our history, no other group in the United States had been forcefully removed from their homes. And we can see the media kept reinforcing this legalized discriminations. Japs keep moving, a white neighborhood. Ouster of all Japs in California near. So again, legal discrimination. Now we're going to take a look at some egregious, stereotypical propaganda posters. And this again was reinforced through the media and in all business places. Throughout the war, American propaganda posters were produced and showed the Japanese using the grossest racial stereotypes. They were prominently displayed everywhere in manufacturing sites, post offices, public buildings, and it was reinforced, as I said earlier, by the newspapers, media, radio, and in the movies. These are pretty ugly, dangerous propaganda posters. And we've seen these type of things before in Germany as well. Okay, images of deportation. And what do we see here in the right-hand corner? We see an older man holding a baby. We see groups of people congregating. And we see someone, a Japanese grocery store claiming his American citizenship. Men were taken away without notice. And that's why in the right-hand corner, you don't see a younger man holding a baby. It's probably the grandfather. So men were taken away without notice, leaving families with no means of support. Crops were left unharvested. Bank accounts were frozen. They had to leave their homes only with what they could carry. This included bedding, linen, clothing, dishes, maybe a few utensils. Everyone was bewildered and confused. Many lost titles to their homes. The Department of Justice established 26 isolation camps scattered in 16 states and in the territories of Alaska and Hawaii. And we can look, if you look up close, we can see the desperate look on these people's faces. Families were split and separated. And we can see here, again, the horrified look on these little children's faces, and mothers carrying their babies and a few of their household items. False stories in the media were published about these people being spies and saboteurs. The war was the perfect pretext for anti-Japanese campaign. Posters were put up in Washington, Oregon, and California, and Arizona that read, "All Japanese people, both alien and non-aliens, will be evacuated." And it reminds me of many other images that we have seen in Europe during the war, the families being gathered and split and looking desperate. And here, as we said, here's a map of all the different camps throughout the country. Some of them were located in isolated areas in California, but all the way up and down the West Coast. Okay, now we're going to talk about some of the conditions of the camps. And if you can look at the right-hand corner, we can see how primitive and unfriendly and bleak these accommodations were in the barracks that we see here. County fairgrounds, racetracks, and exhibition halls were hastily converted into detention camps. Many animal stables in the fairgrounds were converted into homes as well. The camps had barbed wire, fences, searchlights, and guard towers like a prison. The camps weren't built for the occupants' safety or comfort. Their mail and newspapers were censored. The Japanese language was banned at meetings, and all the religious Buddhist and Shinto religious practices were suppressed. So we can see here these bleak accommodations all over 26 isolation camps scattered in 16 states and in the territories of Alaska and Hawaii. In June 1942, the United States Navy won a decisive victory at the Battle of Midway, and the tide shifted in favor of the United States. They recognized that Japan was no longer militarily capable of attacking the West Coast, including Hawaii. But both the military and the U.S. government were aware of this fact, but they went ahead with plans to build permanent mass detention facilities in the interior deserts in the West and the Mississippi Delta region. So people were still incarcerated after 1942. Here we see people working in the fields. They were detainees at these different relocation camps. So some of the Japanese were moved and volunteered to relieve the critical labor shortage, and they were granted seasonal leaves. Others were given leaves to fill the labor shortage in the Midwest and East Coast factories. So they were moved from their camps to alleviate the labor shortage in other areas. But these leaves were not a form of parole, since they weren't free to go or do anything they wanted. The Japanese Americans were known for their pride in rarely being recipients of welfare or locked in prisons, but the camps made them wards of the government. Some members of Congress and the State Department proposed legislation to strip all native-born Americans of their Japanese ancestry, of their citizenship, and even deport them to Japan after the war. Other elected officials urged that the imprisoned Japanese Americans be used for exchanging American prisoners of war. Fortunately, none of these extreme measures was taken. And here we see men registering for Selective Service, and people had to give up their passports, but this was mandated registration. Another form of indignity was imposed on these detainees in February 1943. After being imprisoned, all detainees, all 17 years of age or older, were required to answer a questionnaire swearing a loyalty to the United States and their willingness to serve in the United States Armed Forces. It was an outrageous act for the government to require an oath from people already locked up because they were presumed disloyal. So when the United States entered the war in 41, there were about 5,000 Japanese Americans in the armed forces, but they were discharged as unsuitable and classified as enemy nationals. But soon, the United States discovered the need for Japanese language specialists. So they bypassed the Selective Service system and quietly started to recruit men and women of Japanese ancestry for military intelligence and Office of Strategic Service. The strategy was not made public. The Japanese American soldiers worked as translators and interpreters and also had to engage in combat wherever needed. And on the right-hand side, you'll see this 100th Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team that we'll talk about in a minute. And here's the 442nd again. In January 43, the U.S. War Department announced that the Japanese American volunteers would be accepted for combat duty in Europe. Thousands volunteered from the mass detention camps. The volunteers were assigned to a segregated Japanese American unit. Again, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 442nd eventually, this is so interesting, became the most decorated American unit in the U.S. military history for its size and length of service. In January 1944, the service selective system started to draft Japanese American men, even though they were still incarcerated. Most of the 33,000 Japanese Americans who served were in one of the three military units: the 100th Battalion that originated in Hawaii, the 442nd that we just mentioned, and the military intelligence who worked in the Pacific. So these soldiers faced enemy fire while in combat zones, and they were still worrying about their families incarcerated behind barbed wire. Okay? When the war ended, when the Japanese returned to their homes in California, Oregon, and Washington, they found their homes, their farms, and businesses decimated or occupied and unwilling to be returned to rightful owners. This made me think of the survivors after the war returning to their homes and finding their homes looted and other occupants there. Many returned to find their properties had been seized for non-payment of taxes. More acts of violence and terrorism were committed against the Japanese Americans at the end of the war than at the beginning. The last American concentration camp did not close until October 1946, and the last special camp closed in 1952. Those who were deemed disloyal were incarcerated in special high security camps. And Congress appropriated partial restitution, but only a small percent of property of losses was compensated. I want you to think about the tremendous loss of unnecessary deaths, loss of freedom, loss of income, and the long-lasting psychological damage. These Japanese Americans suffered this indignity of being falsely imprisoned by their own government. Let's take a few minutes and listen to the video of some Japanese Americans talk about their experience.
My parents, upon leaving, they lost their restaurant. That was their livelihood. I saw my father cry because for 20 years, he worked so hard, it just took everything out of him.
They told us you could have one suitcase. We first went to what was called an assembly center. There was 4 of us in this one horse's stall.
This is our family number that we are assigned to. We had to keep it on our clothing. We had to wear this wherever we went, especially when we were assigned to different places.
We got on a train and they had all the blinds closed. We couldn't open it up. And we ended up in Utah and they assigned us barracks.
There were these guard towers where sentries were stationed with their firearms.
My brother was in the army. He was fighting over there in Italy, in southern France. And his mother and father and his younger son is in a camp.
So when I got into high school, I felt very strongly of assimilation, and so I joined the Junior Statements Club, the German Club, the high school band, and the a cappella choir.
I did feel I had to prove my Americanness. I wanted to just blend into the woodwork and not make any waves or anything.
When the Korean War started in 1950, I enlisted in the U.S. Army and served my 3 years to prove my loyalty.
I don't think I ever felt that I should prove my American feelings of loyalty. I was born an American, and I was everything that I read and studied and learned was that I was an American.
President Gerald Ford rescinded FDR's executive order on February 19, 1976, 34 years later. And this apology said, I think these are very powerful words. An honest reckoning must include a recognition of our national mistakes as well as our national achievements. Learning from our mistakes is not pleasant, but as a great philosopher once admonished, we must do so if we want to avoid repeating them. I think we should reflect on that for a minute. Learning from our mistakes is not pleasant, but a great philosopher once admonished, we must do so if we want to avoid repeating them. In 1980, Congress passed a law creating a commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians, which was signed by President Carter. This commission conducted hearings in 9 cities, heard testimonies from more than 750 witnesses, and examined over 10,000 documents. Only in 1983 did this commission conclude that the executive order of 9066 by FDR was not justified by military necessity. It was not justified by military necessity. And the decisions which followed it, detention and exclusion, were not driven by analysis of military conditions. So in other words, there was no plausible reason for any reason to detain these Japanese American citizens. Then President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which formally apologized for the injustices that were committed upon those affected by FDR's executive order. It also included an authorization bill to pay reparations. On November 21, 1989, President Bush signed into law H.R. 2991, which established redress funding of $500 million as an entitlement for 3 years. And then in October 1990, survivors of the camp, and of course at this time they were probably elderly, began receiving $20,000. The apology from President Bush said, "A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and uphold rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize the serious injustices that were done to our Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice." And again, this happened in 1990, decades and decades after this terrible chapter of the Japanese Americans interned. Okay, I like this slide a lot. This is words engraved in front of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. What is past is prologue. And I think this is worth repeating. What is past is prologue. So in conclusion, we can really say that we can learn that when civil liberties are taken away from one group or an individual, they can be taken away from any group or individual. So from the summary of the Japanese American experience, we can clearly see 3 dangerous signs that created this shameful chapter in American history. The first, the consequences of unchecked hatred and discrimination. 2, the power of prejudice. 3, disregard for democratic values. So all of us as citizens in our democracy, we have a responsibility, as we said, to confront abuse of power, civil and human rights violations, including anti-Semitism and all forms of biases that challenge our democratic principles and values. What is past is prologue. So at the Commission, we use our exhibits and our programs to help people learn from the history and to inspire them to act in order to shape a future different from the past. So again, thank you for joining us. And I also want to thank Patrice for researching and locating the wonderful images that you have just seen.
On behalf of the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust, thank you for joining us today. And should you have any questions about today's program, please email Sandra Crane at holocaust.georgia.gov. Thank you very much.